are you really going to trust yourself to darkness? I mean, that's the thing. Like, you're going to hide away in darkness. So you're really like relying on the evil
Yeah,
in
you're
the
like a
world.
cockroach.
Yeah, yeah. You're trying to hide your evil deeds, right? In darkness, only multiplies evil,
Mm.
and I think is kind of what the problem is. And when you place your trust in the light, right, then you're placing your trust in life and exposing your deeds to the light. That eliminates evil and it increases life. And I think that's where you get into that upward spiral, like
Hmm.
Jesus is talking about. I came so you'd have life and have it to the full.
Yeah.
Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy,
And I'm Caleb.
and you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. In this episode, we're continuing our series, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And we're going to be looking at the Old Testament book of Lamentations, where Jerusalem is a deserted and dark and empty place. And in the New Testament, we're going to look at the light in the dark, empty place, which is Jesus coming into the dark emptiness. So, Lamentations can be kind of a tough book to read, right? If you've read it in preparation for this, then you've probably already experienced that. If you haven't read it, then maybe you should stop the video and read it. It's only 5 chapters long, so it's not too bad to read. Um, but Jeremiah, who we just covered in our last episode, he had it tough as a prophet because he had a terrible message that the whole city was going to be destroyed, the whole country was going to be destroyed by the Babylonians, and everyone was going to be taken into captivity. And all of that had happened, and the city had been completely destroyed, walls knocked down, and everything burned. And yet he was left behind in the city with several other people, groups of people, and he was seeing all of his oracles realized. So it's pretty tough for him. He's writing um, Lamentations from that perspective, and you see the relationship between his own suffering and that of Jerusalem, and they're tied together by the poems that he writes in Lamentations. And so um, that's where Jeremiah finds himself. It's a dark, empty place, and the problem with a dark, empty place is that there's just no light there. If there was a light, it wouldn't be a dark, empty place, and you'd be able to find your way out of it. But in Jeremiah's case, and in the case of many of our lives, where we get into a difficult situation, there's no light. We don't know where to go. We don't know the way out. In this case, it's the city of Jerusalem. And so, Caleb, you're the historian, the official Biblicus historian. So, can you tell us how this happened to Jerusalem, the great city of Jerusalem?
Yeah, if you've been listening to the last couple of episodes, you should have seen this coming. We did Isaiah and Jeremiah, which prophesied the destruction um, of the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the southern kingdom of Judah, and now it's happened, and they're dealing with the aftermath. So we've heard it all before, but in honor of Jeremiah, let's hear it again and again.
That's right. That was our theme from last
So
episode.
So back in Kings, you might remember we talked about this story. This was Second Kings. We talked about a story about Josiah when the priest found the scroll of the law and brought it to him, and Israel was uh, so dedicated to God that no one even knew what it was. I don't know what's this thing, and everyone had forgotten about it. So we're going to read the passage when they've brought the law and presented it to Josiah, and they began to read it to him. This is 2 Kings 22:11 through 20. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Akbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Isaiah the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Akbor, Shaphan, and Isaiah went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. She said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and aroused my anger by all the idols their hands have made, my anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become a curse and be laid waste. And because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place." So they took her answer back to the king.
So it's such a terrible passage because it's got good things in it, but the terrible things in it too, right?
Mhm.
It's like Josiah was a good person. He humbled himself before God and um, chastened himself, and he made a lot of good corrections for
Yeah, he
for
told
the
the
people.
people to observe the law again.
But there's nothing he by himself could do. I mean, it was too far down the line. The fuse had already been lit.
Yeah.
The people were just lost in their sin, and they weren't going to turn it around. Yeah. So later, after Josiah was dead, right, Zedekiah became the final king of Judah, and so we're going to jump down to 2 Kings 25 1 through 12 and read that and see how things wrapped up.
Yeah. And remember, Jeremiah's already been prophesying at this point.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. So here it is, Jeremiah. I'm sorry, Second Kings
Sorry.
25. 2 Kings 25. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the command of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields.
Yeah. So that's pretty rough to read.
Yeah. And so you kind of
Mm.
see the state of the city. It's been under siege for all this time. There was no food left. People were starving to death.
Mhm.
And and then, how Zedekiah is treated, for being unfaithful to the king. He has his sons killed before him and his eyes poked out. So the last thing he ever sees in his life is all of his children being wiped out. And so it's just
That was pretty typical
yeah.
historically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Blinding someone, in particular, was a way of getting them out of politics. It was actually seen as merciful. You didn't
Mhm.
kill them, but you made sure they wouldn't be a threat.
Yeah.
They're basically a cripple from that point on.
Yeah, and then as we talked about last time, the Babylonians had this habit of, knocking down the buildings and burning everything, which made this very distinct Babylonian destruction that we can date everything by.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the wet bandits in Home Alone.
Yeah, you're right. Marv and Nebuchadnezzar are basically one and the same.
Marvin, Harry,
At
Nebuchadnezzar,
least
and
when he has a
Nebuzaradan.
yeah.
All right, so but they left the poor behind, um, and everybody else was deported, and that's kind of an interesting strategy for the Babylonians because, I mean, here's the people who were already the poorest people in maybe the least privileged people, and so you elevate them, say, hey, the whole land's yours now, so
Yeah.
you kind of look like you're being nice to them, and Jeremiah was one of the people who remained behind.
Well,
Um,
I mean, I don't think that was necessarily the motivation. I think they just wanted to take anyone who was educated or skilled, and bring them back to make them, benefit the empire.
yeah. I mean, if you don't want an uprising, though, if you give the poorest people their own property and
Yeah,
stuff,
that's true.
you know.
Yeah.
So, so Jeremiah, he remained in Jerusalem as well, and we talked about that last episode. But um, he writes lamentation about the deplorable state of the city. And so, a brief outline of Lamentations, just to give you a real quick rundown, and if you read it yourself, in the first chapter, he talks about how deserted the city is, and he talks about it from his own perspective, and then the city speaks at toward the end of the chapter. In the second chapter, he talks about God's anger and how no one can escape it. No one in Jerusalem was going to escape it, and or had escaped it. And then in chapter 3, which is kind of the pinnacle of the book, Jeremiah speaks for himself and also for Jerusalem, and kind of ties the two together, his fate and Jerusalem's fate, and sort of um, talks about how they're both desolate. And then in chapter 4, it talks about how Jerusalem is completely desolate and also dishonored among all the nations. And then in chapter 5, the people cry out to God, for relief. And um, we'll look at these in more detail as we go through it.
Yeah, and another thing we wanted to point out, we've talked about Hebrew poetry before. This is a poetry book. One of the ways that this poem is structured in the Hebrew is that each verse begins with a different letter of the alphabet going through the alphabet, but in Hebrew. So that won't be the case in the English translation. And in chapter 3, it's tripled down. It's 3 verses in a row with the first letter, then 3 verses in a row with the second letter, beginning each line. And that does explain sometimes why the poem seems to take a sudden change in topic or in
Yeah.
direction. And you can imagine why, because some letters tend to be more rare than others. That's true in other languages too. Imagine if you were going to try to do this in English, and you went through W, lots of words that start with W, and then you come to X, and
Yeah.
and we were talking about this earlier and joking, if you were writing the same poem in English about Jerusalem being desolate, why have you forsaken us? The xylophones
Are all gone.
yeah.
All the xylophones are broken. They're missing.
Yeah.
They're missing their hammers. I mean, I don't know.
X-rays would show my broken bones.
Yeah. The
The zoo
xanthan gum is gone, and the ice cream isn't as
zebras
good
are
anymore.
all stolen from the zoo. Like, you would suddenly run
Yeah.
out of anything relevant to talk about.
Yeah.
So sometimes it forces a change and it feels maybe like a sudden change, but it's probably because they're trying to keep that structure.
Yeah. All right. So, but still, you still get the overall feeling of Jeremiah's sense of loss. So let's look at Lamentations 1, verses 1 and 2, and kind of see the, everything, every piece of literature, the introduction sets the tone. And so here's Jeremiah's intro, Lamentations 1, verses 1 and 2. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies.
That language, she who was a queen has become a slave, reminded me of Isaiah chapter 3 when we did the Isaiah lesson. And God is basically just running through all the different ways that that you can think about what's coming to Israel, and talking about overturning them, degrading them, burning like a wildfire burning through. Or in that passage, chapter 3, it was talking about a woman being robbed of all her beauty. So her jewelry, her fine clothes, she's left in rags and ashes, and that reminded me of that. You know, the queen becomes a slave. It's a
Yeah.
total, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
reversal of the role.
Well, you imagine the great city of Jerusalem with the temple and all the gold and, you know, the great, at the great distance, you could see Jerusalem up on the hill and everything. And so
Hmm.
now it's destroyed. And so, Jeremiah is the weeping prophet, they call him, right? But he says that Jerusalem is weeping also.
Hmm.
And so, um, and he also, gives voice to the city uh, again later in the chapter, beginning in verse 11 through 16. He says, "Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you? All who pass by, look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me?" This is the city, talking. "That the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire, sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, faint all the day long. My sins have been bound into a yoke by his hands, and they were woven together. They have been hung on my neck, and the Lord has sapped my strength. He has given me into the hands of those I cannot withstand. The Lord has rejected all the warriors in my midst. He has summoned an army against me to crush my young men. In his winepress the Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah. This is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed."
It's kind of like, yeah, if you had listened to Jeremiah, then that's that's what would have happened.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be surprised. Of course, knowing the reason for it doesn't make it any less sad. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
doesn't necessarily help someone who's grieving to explain the logical reasons why this has come to pass.
Yeah. And I've been talking about the dark, empty place, and I forgot to mention, if you haven't been listening to our series, that's where we started back in episode
Yeah.
1, because in the book of Genesis, in the first 2 verses, it talks about a dark and empty world,
Mhm.
and so we often talk about the dark, empty place in our episodes. And so here you see the dark, empty place starting to take shape, and all that Jeremiah is talking about here. You
Mhm.
just see you can see the busy, bustling city being emptied out of all the things that it used to have. Its warriors and its spirit and its children.
Yeah.
And it's
The
just
other theme you could have taken from that first chapter is just weeping,
yeah,
because that keeps coming up.
yeah. There's just weeping, weeping.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you get to chapter 2, and it's like you feel like it's the enemy that did all this, because it's talking about, all the fire raining down on it and everything, which is what the Babylonians did. Then you get to chapter 2,
Mhm.
verses 1 through 8. Caleb, you want to read that?
Yeah. How the Lord has covered daughter Zion with the cloud of his anger. He has hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. That's almost, I can kind of picture that comically, like a spoiled king, like throwing his footstool across the room.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now he's not remembered his footstool. Without pity, the Lord has swallowed up all the dwellings of Jacob. In his wrath, he has torn down the strongholds of daughter Judah. He has brought her kingdom and its princes down to the ground in dishonor. In fierce anger, he has cut off every horn of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand at the approach of the enemy. He has burned in Jacob like a flaming fire that consumes everything around it. Like an enemy, he has strung his bow. His right hand is ready. Like a foe, he has slain all who were pleasing to the eye. He has poured out his wrath like fire on the tent of daughter Zion. The Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces and destroyed her strongholds. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation for daughter Judah. He has laid waste his dwelling like a garden. He has destroyed his place of meeting. The Lord has made Zion forget her appointed festivals and her Sabbaths. In his fierce anger, he has spurned both king and priest. The Lord has rejected his altar and abandoned his sanctuary. He has given the walls of her palaces into the hands of the enemy. They have raised a shout in the house of the Lord as on the day of an appointed festival. They being the enemies, I think. The enemies are, shouting and cheering. The Lord determined to tear down the wall around daughter Zion. He stretched out a measuring line and did not withhold his hand from destroying. He made ramparts and walls lament. Together they wasted away.
So it turns out it's God who's really
Mhm.
bringing the destruction, and his anger has been stoked, and that was the people's doing, right? They didn't listen, like we talked about last week, again and again,
Mhm.
God came, and again the people didn't listen. They ignored God's lessons, God's messages from the prophets. And so the Lord is doing all the destroying because it's His covenant, like we talked about last week. The prophets are the enforcers of the covenant, and they come and bring you a message. Say the curses of the covenant are going to come on you if you don't listen, and they didn't listen, and so that's why God's doing all the destroying.
Yeah, I mean, all I could think of reading that is just the wrath of the Lord and the fear of the Lord. Obviously, we love God, we trust God. We're also supposed to fear God. I think that's a pretty strong reminder there. And that doesn't mean that it's not still a loving relationship. If you're, like in a traditional home, I grew up with a stay at home mom. And if we were disrespecting mom all day, then it got to be 5 o'clock and you're like, oh, dad's coming home. And mom's going to be tired of us and tell him that we've been acting up and rude and, you know, little demons all day. And then we're going to be in trouble. It's like that scene in Christmas Story when Ralphie gets in the fight and
Yeah,
his
yeah.
dad's coming in and was like, well, it's over.
Yeah, yeah. The sky's changing colors. My
Yeah.
dad will be home soon. Um, yeah, it sounds like you had a terrible dad,
Yeah,
man.
pretty much. No, but if you when you
Yeah.
deserve punishment
Hmm.
because you have been wicked, then whoever it is, whether it's God, dad, the government, whoever's enforcing the justice, that you should be afraid.
Well, and that gets right back to the prophets being the enforcers of the covenant, right? So
Hmm.
it's Jeremiah was the one who's having to tell them, look, what's going to happen. And then it happens. And so then in verse 11 of chapter 2, Jeremiah says, my eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. And so, like, once again, you're seeing this. Why is Jeremiah called the weeping prophet? And he's begging the city, right, to cry out to God, like to be as broken as he is, and to cry out to God. And we know they haven't been up to this point. But in chapter 2, verse 19, the city does cry out to God. So, and so, well, here's where he's crying out to the city. He says, arise, cry out in the night as the watches of the night begin. Pour out your heart like water in the presence of the Lord. Lift up your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint from hunger at every street corner. And then, so sorry, I jumped ahead there. And then the city
Yeah,
answers.
yeah.
So,
And I that's the second passage there in a row that we read that talks about the children fainting from hunger.
mm,
I was a little bit, caught off guard there just because the notes, one of the verses that we had in the notes here wasn't on the slide. So we didn't read the one where it says the children ask, where's the bread and wine? I thought that was such a cool
mm,
thing to
mhm.
include there, with some foreshadowing.
Yeah,
They could have asked for milk and honey, that might be what you'd expect the promised land to have, right?
yeah, yeah. So, so the city finally does cry out, and it's
Yeah.
and in Lamentations 2:20 and 22 through 22, it says, "Look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they have cared for? Should priests and prophets be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young men and young women have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered them without pity. As you summoned to a feast day, so you summoned against me terrors on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. Those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed." So,
Yeah, I think it's interesting questions there. Should women eat their own children because they're like resorting to cannibalism to survive. And I think God's response would be, well, yeah, well, they shouldn't have been offering them on altars to Moloch either.
Yeah.
So I don't
Yeah.
understand what the difference is.
Yes.
And then should the priests and prophets be killed? Yeah, because they were terrible.
Yeah. Well, you see though, like the total emptiness, the total darkness, that they've fallen into. I mean, what worse situation can you come up with than having to eat your own child to survive?
Yeah.
It's beyond comprehension, really. It's just more darkness, more emptiness, and it just grows in the psalm. So then you get to chapter 3, and so Jeremiah lists more of his afflictions, um, and he's piling them up. The things that have happened to him.
Him personally. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he gets to verse 21 through 33, which is kind of the most famous, well-known part of Lamentations, I think. So, Caleb, you want to read that?
Yeah. We get one little bright spot in here. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. I want to, if we can jump back to 26 there, it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. And then again in 28, let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Those two verses really jumped out at me there. It's like, be still and know that I am God, especially because our society is so far from that. And that's one of the things here, God was saying, you're distracting yourself with all these things, all these idols and other, sins. And so I'm just going to take everything away, and you have no option but to sit there and think.
Yeah, well, I mean,
suddenly you realize kind of the reality.
the devastation is so terrible, but then when you stop and look and think about it, you realize that there's wisdom in it.
Mm-hmm.
God knows what we needed or what the people needed then, and they needed this to happen. There needed to be, like we talked in Isaiah a couple of episodes ago, about the cleansing that had to come to the land and had to come to the people so that they could start over anew.
Mm-hmm. And I really think, like I hinted at there, we need to apply this to ourselves in our society. I mean, with our smartphones and all of our media and our digital electronic stuff, we can just distract ourselves constantly. The word entertainment, that used to mean the literal. If you break that word down, the enter part, it's not enter as in to go into. The etymology there, it comes from entra. If you know Spanish, entra means in between. So entertainment, it was to hold. Tain is like obtain or contain something, to hold. It was to hold, like the holdover, to hold you over from one thing to another, something to pass the time in between. That's what entertainment was, to pass the time in between the constructive and useful things you're supposed to be doing. And we have gotten to the point where we're almost reversing that, where gotta go to work, but as soon as I get home, the ball game's on, video game time, or whatever you're doing, like to entertain yourself. Of course, I'm sure not everyone is in that boat, but I just look around, especially people my age, seem to just be living to entertain themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think we have got to recognize the problem with that, and the wisdom there in those two verses, 26 and 28, of just waiting and being patient and being still and thinking, reflecting. I've heard a quote, I don't remember who to attribute it to now, that if all of the problems in the world could be solved if you just sit in a dark room alone for an hour and don't do anything. You just listen to God.
Well, and like the afflictions never last forever, right? Just like your plan of sitting in a room for an hour, it doesn't last forever, but it gives you some time to contemplate, that God's taking care of you through the darkness, through the times of emptiness. He's present. You can't get to a dark place that he's not present.
Mhm.
Even like at the beginning of the world, his spirit was hovering over the
Yeah.
water. And even while Jeremiah is sitting in Jerusalem, he's like, well, God's love and compassions never fail. This won't last forever because, God didn't want to bring the afflictions, but the people brought them on themselves, right? But they were necessary. They were
Mhm.
the only way through this. But they were so bad. The people had gotten so bad that this was the only way out.
Yeah.
And like you said, sometimes you just have to wait patiently until you see the solution because God brings you the light.
That's the hardest thing to do, probably,
Yeah.
to do nothing. Reminds me of a great SpongeBob episode.
Well, the tough thing, a great SpongeBob episode.
I thought you would know that one, where they have like it's like a magic 8 ball, but it's a pull string
Oh yeah, yeah,
seashell.
yeah,
And they
yeah.
keep asking it what to
The
do, and it
magic
says
conch.
nothing, and so they just sit there. Yeah, yeah, the magic conch.
Yeah, yeah, the magic
And then
conch.
in the end, sitting there and doing nothing was what actually saved them.
That's true.
Biblical wisdom, SpongeBob
Yeah.
SquarePants.
Somehow. Well, and so if you think about this story, though, okay, so Jeremiah realizes, okay, God's compassions are going to come through in the end because they never fail. But for right now, the reality is the dark, empty place, right?
Mhm.
And the horrors, the absolute horrors, some of which we just read of Jerusalem during the siege and after its destruction. You
Yeah,
know, it's
infanticide, cannibalism.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you can't really imagine anything worse.
yeah. So then jumping into chapter 4, right? Um, you have some more, negative stuff like in chapter 4, verses 9 through and 10. It says, "Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away for lack of food from the field. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who became their food when my people were destroyed. The Lord has given full vent to his wrath. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion that consumed her foundations." Just more of the brutal details of the punishment.
Mhm.
And,
And I wanted to point out at some point here, um, in chapter 2, we were talking about how God is the one who kind of brought this wrath on Israel, even though it's a foreign king. But like in Jeremiah, we saw him call Nebuchadnezzar his servant, right?
yes,
Which is normally something reserved for like David or Moses or somebody.
right.
So, but I wanted to point out as well, like the Israelites did this as well. Like they built this, they created the problem, and then God created this solution, which unfortunately has to be for a time, total subjugation.
Mhm.
So that like they're also responsible. It's kind of a dark, empty place of our own making sometimes, or
Yes.
at least that we deserve.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so bad that Jeremiah says that it would be better off to be one of the people that was killed,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and that's just, sometimes that's a
Hey, you know who
reality,
I'm
but,
jealous of? I'm jealous of Dave over there with the sword through his face.
well, it doesn't, well, because suffering doesn't take away your obligation to live, right? We saw that with Job. We've seen that, in Psalm 22.
Mm,
Like we have an obligation to live. Jesus talks about that in we've looked at that before, talking about like, um, live life and live it to the full, right? Okay.
Job saw that would even
And
transcend death too.
yeah,
Yeah,
but the problem with that is like Jeremiah is discovering right now is like I've got an obligation to live in the worst possible
yeah,
circumstances imaginable.
yeah.
Job like circumstances. Job sat in the burnt rubble of his house,
Like the whole city
and
is
yeah,
that.
Jeremiah is sitting in the burnt rubble of the city.
Yeah,
And so and he
yeah.
had
I never thought
lived
about that.
he had,
There's like a million Jobs now.
yeah. And so he has to somehow find a way to live through this, and that's tough. That's really hard. And that's why the book's called Lamentations, because he's lamenting it. But he gets to chapter 8, 1 through 3. It says, Remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become fatherless. Our mothers are widows. Right? He's asking God to look at it and see it, like because he's having to stare at it every day, and he's like, please God, look on this and see how bad our situation is.
Hmm.
And he was saying this is what's happened to your people, and he's sort of calling on God, if you still see us as your people, right? Then um, if you still see us as such, then come and do something for us. Help us.
Yeah. Later on here, he talks about, I think it's verse 15. He talks about turning their dancing into mourning, which is an inversion of
Mhm.
what's in Psalm 30, that God turns my mourning into dancing, and
Yeah.
that caught my eye reading through it.
Yeah.
It's everything's upside down here.
So the people are calling out now to God and asking him to help, and so they make their final plea at the end of the chapter, chapter 5, and they say, "You Lord," oh, this is Lamentations 5:19-22. "You Lord reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure."
Yeah, verse 20 there obviously should ring some bells. Why do you forsake us so long? That should call back Psalm 22, of course, our lesson on that.
Yeah. Why have you forsaken me?
Hmm.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the people are asking for restoration, right? But it's uncertain if God's ever going to extend it to them,
Hmm.
because they have completely abandoned the covenant.
And that's the last verse. That's the way it
Yeah.
ends. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, restore to us, we know you can do it, unless you just don't want to, and you probably don't because we're really bad.
Yeah.
And we'll just leave it at that.
That's right. If God
Sweet dreams.
if well, if God has utterly rejected them, then this would be the darkest, emptiest place of all, right?
Yeah.
Because even at the beginning, when we talked about in Genesis 1 and 2, God was hovering over the surface of the water.
That would be,
And
that would make it hell, essentially,
yes,
already,
that's right.
even if they were alive.
That's right.
That's what a lot of theologians have speculated, that hell exists even on earth if you're in that total
Hmm.
kind of evil and you've completely closed yourself off to God. It's one way of looking at it.
Yeah. And that's kind of what Jeremiah is describing with Jerusalem here. It's become the dark, empty place. And the question is, has God utterly rejected us? And so um, the Old Testament takeaway is that there is no light in the dark, empty place, but God can lead you out of the dark. So that's kind of like the message Jeremiah has there in the middle in chapter 3.
Hmm.
God,
Yeah,
God's,
the hopeful part.
yeah. So,
I
but
don't know how that snuck in there.
well, one of the reasons I wanted to say that there is no light in the dark, empty place is that when we taught um, episode 1, and we talked about the dark, empty place, and that God, is no dark, empty place that God can't turn into something more beautiful than you can imagine. And I was teaching that at church, and there were several families there who had lost children or had various other catastrophes, and they challenged that a little bit and said, that's hard to hear because I'm still in the dark, empty place.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, my only response to that is, well, if it had a light, right, it wouldn't be the dark, empty place. If you could see your way out of it, you could see a light, you could just walk toward it and be out of the dark emptiness.
Yeah,
And
and that's, I mentioned earlier, it doesn't. If someone's in that situation, it's not going to help them to, explain. Well, here's why it happened, and here's why it'll be
Mhm.
okay, or whatever. Like there's only one possible response, which is just to sit with them, suffer through it with them.
Yeah.
The wisest thing Job's friends ever did when they showed up and he was suffering was to sit with him. And as soon as they opened their mouths, they proved themselves to be total idiots.
Yeah.
But
Well,
the good news is that we have a God who wants to do exactly that, to
mhm.
to join us in our suffering.
And he never does utterly reject us. And that was kind of the question
Right.
was, have you utterly rejected us? But he hasn't. And like we said in Genesis, the Spirit of God was hovering over the water, and that was enough. Like all you need is the potential
Hmm.
of God. And that potential is enough to bring you out of any problem.
Yeah.
So, and in this case, like Jeremiah said, you know that he's steadfast. You know that he has compassion. You know that he loves you. And if you just wait, he's going to act. He's going to save.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. And so, as we're going to switch to the New Testament here,
mhm.
that I think is his ultimate answer. Is like it's not really going to do any good to talk about it. So I'm just going to join you in the suffering by
Yeah.
becoming incarnate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Because like so the title of our series, remember, is Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And we go through every book of the Old Testament so far, up from Genesis now up to Lamentations, and we say, what's the main theme of this book? And then we say, well, how did Jesus incorporate that into his teaching? And so we're going to see how Jesus talks about leading out of darkness. And so we're going to begin in Matthew 4, verses 12 through 17, if you want to read that.
When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, that's John the Baptist, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which is by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah: Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near.
So you hear in this passage, you have the difference between darkness and light, how the light penetrates into the darkness, and that contrast, is catching your attention, it's catching everybody's attention in these passages. And so Jesus comes into a dark place for people who are separated from God because they're not part of, say, the family of Israel or whatever. And this message is coming to all of them that everyone in the world is going to see this light, and it's going to penetrate into the darkest places of the world.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, was a quotation from Isaiah 9.
And remember, like, it's the land of Jews and Gentiles in Galilee. Like, going back to the temple episode where it's a light, it's supposed to be a place of joy for all the nations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this theme of light in the Gospels is probably most highly developed in the Gospel of John.
Hmm.
And so we're going to read John 1, verses 1 through 5. It says, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
Yeah. That's such a brilliant encapsulation of everything we just talked about,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
from Genesis to Lamentations, the incarnation. John was, you know, a brilliant theologian. I mean, there's again the light shining in the darkness, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the important thing here that he adds is, and the darkness has not overcome it, or it depends on the translation there. A lot of times it says it has not comprehended it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and it's the darkness isn't really a tangible thing. It's the absence of light, Like there aren't sources of darkness, but there are sources of light,
Yeah.
and darkness just means where light is not. So it's always defined by the light itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so if Jesus is the light, then evil, darkness, only exists in the sense that it's opposed to him.
Yeah. Well, and I love the way life and light are equated in
Hmm.
this, because that life and that life, they're the uh, the life was the light of all mankind. So the two are being equated,
Yeah.
and darkness, of course, is often equated with death. But we're we're told here that darkness cannot win against light, and it's kind of like that used to be something I think that everybody agreed on was that truth always conquers over falsehood, and the
True.
right
Yeah.
always wins over the wrong, and
Yeah.
you know,
Truth will out.
yeah, cheaters never prosper, and all those things. And I don't know that people believe that now. Like I don't think that that's a general belief in society anymore. We used to have like the Superman TV show, and it's like, the cheerful music and the guy standing up with his chest sticking out, and it's
Yeah.
like he's gonna always triumph for the right, and everybody believes that. And I don't know that's sad that we've lost hope in that. So the light of Christ can still shine into our world today
It's the
and bring
same
that back.
light, and it's the same world. So
Yeah. Yeah, jumping back into Matthew 5, 14 through 16, he says, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." And I love that because it's like light should never be stifled,
mhm.
right? And light is life. And so life should never be stifled. And those are things that we need to let shine out. We need to let our light shine to other people. We need to live our lives openly, before God and other people, and live them to the full. And there should be no hiding of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Jesus will speak even more directly to that right here. So this is John 3:16 through 21. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. So just this morning, I didn't plan this. I just happened to be reading Genesis 3. And, uh, multiple times I've been struck by these apparent coincidences in something else that I happened to read or hear right before we do a lesson on something incredibly relevant. And in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve eat the fruit and they hear the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden of the light, right? I mean, Jesus was the light of the world and Jesus is God. So the light comes into the garden, right? God comes into the garden. And what do? They run and hide behind trees. It says they hide amongst the trees of the garden. And God asks, "Where are you?" Not that he doesn't know, but if you go back to ideas about, like in Psalm 1, we talked about God knows the way of the righteous. And we compared that to one of Christ's lessons about when he says to those who showed charity to the least, it says that they showed charity to him, so he knows them, and those who didn't, he says he doesn't know them, being known or not known by God, right? I think that's kind of what's at play there in Genesis. So Adam and Eve immediately hide after the first sin because they don't want to come into the light. They're afraid that their deeds will be exposed.
Yeah.
And
Well, and the thing about that is, okay, with whether it's Adam and Eve, whether it's Jeremiah and the people in Jerusalem sitting in the devastated city, whatever, are you really going to trust yourself to darkness? I mean, that's the thing. Like, you're going to hide away in darkness, so you're really like relying on the evil
yeah,
in
you're
the
like a
world.
cockroach.
Yeah, yeah. You're trying to hide your evil deeds, right? In darkness, only multiplies evil,
Mm,
and I think is kind of what the problem is. And when you place your trust in the light, right, then you're placing your trust in life, and exposing your deeds to the light that eliminates evil and it increases life. And I think that's where you get into that upward spiral, like
Hmm.
Jesus is talking about. I came so you'd have life and have it to the full.
Yeah.
I want you to be in the light. I want you to be open about things. You just keep getting better and better. I don't want you trusting yourself to darkness and trying to hide things in the dark and trusting darkness and evil
Yeah.
to protect you.
Well, go
You
back
know,
to Psalm 32, right? When David hid his guilt, what happened?
right?
It ate him up from
Hmm.
the inside.
Yeah,
And when he said, I'll confess my sins to the Lord, then God shows him mercy. And then he
and
gets back on that upward spiral, like you're talking about. That's exactly what Jesus is saying here.
that was our
Like
walking in the light
he
episode.
says, he doesn't say some people like darkness instead of light. All people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were
Hmm.
evil, right?
Yeah.
But but then he says, whoever lives by the truth comes into the light. So he's calling you to do that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So then in John 8, verse 12, it says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So,
And that comes in John 8, which is a huge chapter. The context is a dispute over who Jesus is, and it ends with like one of the most famous lines where he tells them, "Before Abraham was, I am," which is an obvious claim to divinity, which is why they try to stone him. I mean, from a Jewish perspective, there's no. I think just saying "I am God" wouldn't even have been as clear. That's the way he chose to phrase that,
yeah.
uh, which is why they can't accept it. It's blasphemy to their ears. So that's the context here. He tells them, "I am the light of the world," which that already should have been obvious. What are you saying there?
Well, and so it's interesting, because to follow Christ is to have light, to have the light,
Mhm.
and to have light is to have life. And so all these passages are saying the same thing, that the light of life, this passage says. And so there are no negatives to walking in the light. Like I said, walking in darkness, trusting yourself to darkness, it's all negative. Walking in the light and giving yourself over to the light, giving yourself over to life, right? It's all positive stuff.
Mhm. All right. So John 12, verse 30, 35 and 36. Then Jesus told them, "You are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they are going. Believe in the light while you have the light, so that you may become children of light." When he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them. So remember just the last episode with Jeremiah, where we were talking about that idea of what's translated in the NIV as again and again. The literal translation is probably load the backs of pack animals because it was only safe to travel in the day. Jesus is using that same analogy here, saying, there's a time that's appropriate for traveling. You've got to do it while the light is out.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, they rise up early in the morning or again and again. And then the idea that God was getting up and preparing so that he could travel during the day. That was where the whole idiom came from. And so here, Jesus is saying we only have so much time. And it's just like Jeremiah saying, look, God's come to you again and again, and you haven't been listening. And how long do you think God's going to wait for us to reciprocate, his love? He's told us about his love over and over again. When are we going to reciprocate? And so Jesus is calling on us to embrace the light now,
Hmm.
while we can. Embrace the light. And light because light is life, it grows. So that's one of the cool things. I think the reason he's talking about light being life is because living things grow. And I think he's saying like the light grows,
Hmm.
He's talking about sharing the light with people,
Yeah.
not hiding it. Light grows because it's alive.
Yeah, you don't run
And
out just because you light another candle with yours. Like, it doesn't.
yeah.
It's just added a net amount of light there. It hasn't
Well,
it hasn't
and
like split in half.
like you said, by lighting a candle off of another candle, he says here you'll become children of light, like a
Hmm.
secondary candle lit off of the first one, And so um and the darkness will never overtake you. And so it's just really, really a cool picture, just the growing of light and life.
Yeah.
is what Jesus offers us, not the death, desolation, and destruction that Jeremiah was experiencing in Lamentations, but the light and increasing life of following Christ.
Yeah. Now, I have a book reference. You've had a couple of books that you brought in. I've quoted plenty of things, but never brought one in. So this is The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. Fascinating book. On the title page, I just noticed that it's actually called The Great Divorce: A Dream. So it's kind of really just a thought experiment. You know, he has a bit in the introduction where he says, "Don't take this too seriously." Um, I'm not trying to make any specific claims about the afterlife or anything like that. And it's basically a story. You can look at it as taking place in hell, or I think you can look at it as taking place on earth, even. Um, and it starts very abruptly. And just thinking about the light running out as just the opening couple of sentences here. This is the way it starts. I seemed to be standing in a busy queue by the side of a long, mean street. Evening was just closing in, and it was raining. I had been wandering for hours in similar mean streets, always in the rain and always in evening twilight. Time seemed to have paused on that dismal moment when only a few shops have lit up and it is not yet dark enough for their windows to look cheering. And just as the evening never advanced to night, so my walking had never brought me to the better parts of the town. So it's this twilight, but he's been in it. He's been walking for hours, so it seems to always be twilight. And kind of the gist of it is he's in hell. I think you can kind of look at it as symbolism even for this life, but he's in hell, and the town, the whole world there is always in twilight, like the light's about to go out. And in the center of the town, there's a bus stop that can take you up to the outskirts of heaven. And so there's a possible way out, and that's where he's saying, don't worry, don't take it too seriously. I'm not trying to do serious theology with this book, just kind of exploring some ideas. And there's another conversation. I'm not going to read more of it. He's having a conversation with this guy about the light situation, and that guy mentions, well, you don't want to be out of doors when the lights go out, and he's saying, well, why? Why not? And the implication is something's coming, something bad is about to happen, and this guy who's in front of them in line. Or on the bus already, I think. He wheels around. He's like, whoa, what are you talking about? We don't want any of that conversation. I'll have you know the leading intellectuals actually think this isn't a twilight, but a dawn. We're about to dawn on a new golden age. And, it's like, we got to spin this any way we possibly can. And it's like, it's a refusal. That line, it just reminded me of that book. I do recommend that book. It's short. It's like 130 pages. A pretty interesting experiment about kind of the openness or closedness of our hearts to God or to the light. And, Jesus is saying, you've got the opportunity. Why wait? What are you waiting for? If this is good, and not only good, it's the greatest good, then just seize it right now and don't let go.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so then our final verse here that we have is John 12:44 through 46. Then Jesus cried out, "Whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness." So this is the answer to Lamentations 5:19 through 22. The question was, has God utterly deserted us?
No,
Yeah, no, he has not.
no, it's still a dark, empty place, but there's a light here now. There's a way out.
Yeah. We are not banished to the dark, empty place forever. And so that God has sent the light, and the light is our life.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And remember, going back to like the Genesis episode where with your thought experiment, imagine if God made you first and hadn't made anything and asked you, well, what do you want? And you're like, I don't know, like an easy chair and a bottomless bag of Doritos. Like, no, you're going to be living it up, aren't you? You'll be bored in 12 seconds. If he had asked us if he asked them in Jerusalem, well, what do you want? It'd be like, well, some food, I guess, so we aren't eating each other. Very like small things to ask for. I don't want to bother you. I know we don't really deserve much. Like if we could have standing buildings again. That would be nice. And he goes, well, you don't realize how much I have in store here. I want, you're supposed to ask for me. What do you want? It's supposed to be me. I'm going to come and live with you and bring you to me. And we don't have the capacity to imagine or to ask for what he wants.
Yeah. Well, and then this whole problem of darkness, like we saw, there was darkness at the beginning of the Bible. Everything turns out fine. God creates and makes everything beautiful. We see darkness at the turn of the Testaments here, and Jesus comes as a light and into that darkness. And I think we have a tendency, like I said, don't trust in darkness, but also don't be intimidated by darkness either, right? Because the greater the darkness is, the more obvious the light is, right? The more contrasting, the brighter the light appears.
Yeah, if
Because
you've ever been to a cave and they did the thing where
yeah,
they light like a single match with all the lights out in the cave.
yeah,
Like you can't believe how well you can see from that one little light.
yeah, yeah. So don't trust in the darkness and use it to hide, your own sin. Well, everybody's doing it, so I can get away with it too. But that just multiplies the darkness, right? But trust in the light, right? Because that's trusting in life. And they'll both grow. The light will grow and your life will grow. And you'll have that full and abundant life that Jesus talked about in John chapter 10.
Right. Yeah, so our New Testament takeaway is follow Jesus Christ and you will have light and life without limit.
Yeah, without limit. You can begin following Christ right now. We've talked so many times about that, to confess your sins, profess your faith, repent, and turn and be baptized.
Yeah, John 3, we already read a part of that. Just, John 3 is the perfect summary.
Yeah.
Jesus tells Nicodemus, so you have to be born again of water and the Spirit. You have to believe in me, not to perish.
Yeah. Find a body of believers near you, a church that has a good reputation that you have heard a lot about, or maybe a minister that you've encountered and when he was out, doing ministry in town, and you trust and believe in, and go to them and tell them, I want to make a commitment to Christ. I want to begin my following of Christ. I want to join your body here and be a part of Christ's work in this community. So many ways that you can increase the light in your community. All of those are great ways. Your own personal commitment, your joining of another with other people who are also in that commitment, and the light just gets brighter and your life just gets fuller. And the more of those, more that you participate in the light.
Yeah, that's right.
So he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.